Now, this also, I think, is very interesting. We are perfectly aware that many contemporary Muslims are tired of what they consider outdated material. They would like to discard their intellectual heritage and replace it with truly scientific endeavors, such as sociology. By claiming that the Islamic intellectual heritage is superfluous and that the Quran is sufficient, such people have surrendered to the spirit of the times. Those who ignore the interpretations of the past are forced to interpret their text in the light of the prevailing worldview of the present. This is a far different enterprise than that pursued by the great authorities, who interpreted their present in the light of grand tradition and who never fell prey to up-to-date, the most obsolescent of all abstractions. So one of the beauties of the ancient tradition, a writer writing in the 12th century is writing from the same worldview as a writer in the 3rd century or the 4th century, really. And that's why there's a continuity of interpretation. They did not succumb to the temptations of the time. And one of the things that the moderns do is they interpret everything in light of their time. And then people later will look back and realize how ridiculous much of what they came up with sounds. And that is why if you look at the 19th century, phrenology was considered to be the most up-to-date way of understanding personality. And that was like feeling bumps on people's heads to determine their character types. This was considered deeply scientific in the 19th century. And likewise, there will be things today that 50 years or 100 years from now, people will wonder and marvel at how people could fall for that type of nonsense. This is one of the dangers of that. And then he says, another thing that we find often in short histories of Islamic thought, intellectuals appear a bit foolish for apparently spending a great amount of time discussing irrelevant details. Muslim scholars would go into great detail about certain things, and there's kind of an idea that they were really irrelevant issues. What he says, in fact, much of what they were discussing is being discussed in the contemporary world, but just in different terms. So we have semantic analyses going on now. We have people that are deeply involved in the analyses of language. You will find that amongst the Muslims historically. Some of the most extraordinary scholars of grammar emerged out of the 3rd, 4th, 5th century of Iraq. In fact, there has been a PhD thesis that was done by one scholar showing how a great deal of modern linguistic theory actually comes out of 3rd and 4th century Iraq from linguists that read that material and basically used it to present their own ideas. And that's something Mark Twain said, the ancients stole all of their best ideas from us. So that's an old game, reading ancients and coming up. If you look at some of the most popular authors out there, and if you've read the classics, you know exactly where they're getting their material, but they make it sound like it's update and new, because if you said it was Epictetus who was saying those things in a self-help book, it would sound a little trite. How will I be helped by a slave who lived almost 2,000 years ago in Rome? And then finally he says that we as authors have our own lenses. Some people may criticize us for trying to find Islam's vision of itself within the Islamic intellectual tradition in general and the Sufi tradition in particular, but it is precisely these perspectives within Islam that provide the most self-conscious reflections on the nature of the tradition. So they're definitely working from an intellectual tradition, and it is a classical tradition. The Sufi tradition is not the Sufi tradition that many people now speak ill of, but rather most of the scholars of the past, our greatest scholars, did have a perspective that was rooted in their own spirituality and in an interpretation and an explanation of Islam based on that was in fact part of the science of tasawwuf, what is called tasawwuf. So that is not an innovation, it's in fact part of the tradition, and that's what they show. Now, in the introduction, basically, they say that the religion was established by the Quran through the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. A Muslim is one who submitted to God's will or one who follows the religion of Islam. The Quran is a book that God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ by means of the angel Gabriel. And this is the basic story. That's the story. And now, to flesh that out, over 1400 years ago, on a mount outside of Mecca, in which a man was meditating, and an angel came to him and told him, Iqra, read. And this was the beginning of the revelation, which is called Wahy, the Quran. And from that, everything comes. That's the foundation. So the Quran sets this whole thing in motion. And now we're on a planet in which 1 out of every 5 people believes in the Quran as a revelation from God. So this began with one man given this revelation from an angel. Now, the Quran, they say that the Muslim view is that the Quran, unlike the Christian view, the Quran is only in Arabic. A Christian will generally say, when they speak about the Bible, they'll say, well, it says in the Bible. A Muslim would never say that about Yusuf Ali's commentary if they understand Islam. They'll say, well, the translation says. They will never say the Quran says. You should not say that, because a translation is ultimately an interpretation. And therefore, no Muslim accepts any translation of the Quran as definitive. There is no definitive translation of the Quran because of the nature of the Arabic language and the nature of language in general. Every language has the possibility of multiple interpretations.